Before I will start my content presentation, please allow me to introduce the organization that I'm working in, and maybe that will explain the content and the context within which we work and the matching perspective. For the past 8 years, I work for Austrian Institute of Technology, which is RTO organization, research and technology organization. We are partially owned by Austrian government and partially by Federation of Austrian Industries. We are a large organization. We have 1,300 employees and work very internationally. Actually, maybe one more point that will explain our perspective also on the development in Lithuania. We work 30% in contract research, 30% in co-funded research directly with cities, directly with industry and so on, and 40% we're based on the national funds. So kind of our main task in Austria is to ensure that the knowledge generated in research or the knowledge generated in research projects actually is applied. So we are applied research organization. So that is biggest non-university institution in Austria. Very different role than the universities, although we work with universities a lot, but we work at the same time also with the private sector. And that is our task, to kind of bridge the gap between strategies and implementation. So that's our role. And at the same time, bring in the knowledge that we generate from our international, European and Austrian projects into Austria. So I think this is, since I was asked in preparing this presentation to kind of make connections to Lithuania wherever possible, I think that this is one of the aspects that could be considered in Lithuania: stronger cooperating with European as well as worldwide city know-how as well as national know-how in different types of projects. This is, I kind of mentioned. We do work with governments, with businesses and industries. This explains what I'm trying to say. Actually, my first project at AAT was in China, in planning of low carbon action plan for one of Chinese cities, and this is the map, the green areas where we are most active, and I hope that within the next 5 to 10 years, Lithuania will be there as well. So this is kind of perspective that we come from, and examples of projects we were heavily involved, for instance, in Smart City Framework Strategy development for the city of Vienna, but we are also very familiar with less wealthy urban backgrounds, such as in Latin America, as well as in African cities, and in a heavy collaboration on Horizon 2020 projects, as well as local funded projects in Austria. So this is so far from our background. It was announced that I will talk on the actual planning, but since we are the organization that has this bridging task between private sector, between government, between citizens, we often act as a platform, and that is in a way what could possibly be considered in Lithuania as well, involving the research and knowledge sector much heavier in this role of connecting different sectors, because they are more neutral. For us, we see in all of this international context that often, and that varies really from China to South America to Africa, we are still stuck in the mindset of the past 100 years, trying to achieve something that is projected into the future, wanting something else. And that is the reason why we are looking at these three topics, which is transformation, governance, and integration. And in the middle, these aspects of resilient cities, smart cities, sustainable cities, you name it, healthy cities, sponge cities, all types of labels of cities, without being very clear what are we actually talking about. If we take Vilnius as an example, there are not 5 Vilniuses, one resilient Vilnius, one smart Vilnius, one healthy Vilnius. There is one Vilnius. And the question already there starts, how do we integrate these concepts into one concept of a city that we want to live in, that still provides diversity, that still relates to the past, and that actually brings in aspects of the future into the city. And that is the actual transformation. The other column of the presentation is governance. It's not just a question about the space, but as it was raised before, how and who. And in this corner, we still very much caught up in the structures of the past years. And the question there that we raise as well is, do the structures need to change along with space? Not only the space. Is the space the only dimension within which the change should happen? And then, of course, integration. But I think that these words are often looked at and not clearly defined. So, oh, I'm sorry, that jumped for some reason. Transformation. I would like to share with you our perspective as a research institute. We have to define the dimensions about which we talk and what is actually transformation for us. So for us, transformation is fundamental shifts that change perspectives, mindsets, structures, and practices, and involve diverse range of fields, actors, and levels, while changing and stretching the existing comfortable boundaries and understandings. Because there is often expectation to make an implementation in a city, but yet to have collective agreement from the start. And I think this is kind of counterintuitive to the urban concept, because the cities grew and developed. That's the actual nature of cities. It's diversity, and it is partially disagreement and negotiation. And within that process, to look what levels actually need to transform and shift. And spatial aspect and dimension is one of them, but not all. Governance, same. It's collective set of values, policies, and institutions by which a society manages all of its sectors within the state, civil society, and private sector. And at the same time, this is the role of the governance to actually enable and not to limit actions, or to have to negotiate the dynamics and balance between enabling and control. And this is what we notice at the moment, one of the main levels that is shifting all across the world. This is the same, except maybe for some, in some more, how should I say, not so democratic societies like ours. Integration, I would like to kind of involve all of these words. These words we heard even today in the morning at least 10 times. What do we actually mean by that? What needs to be integrated with what? And what we see now that also across all of the countries, this changes heavily, especially because of these things that we all have in our pocket as well. Smartphones, way of communication, involvement of different types of information. This has already changed, but it hasn't been yet integrated in the decision-making processes. So in that sense, embracing different and diverse perspectives while aiming to achieve a coherent and holistic view on a given subject. It is an attempt to bring together a variety of interlinked and complementary approaches towards improvement and transformation. Of course, we cannot integrate once we have not agreed a collective, future, coherent goal. Switching from the definitions of these three pillars of my presentation, I would still like to last a little bit on this topic of cities, why we are so, and I'm sure you have seen and heard about this topic a lot, but this is just a small part of all the documents that the cities are thematized in. Cities of tomorrow, urban cities, cities and climate change, post-oil cities. In a way, all these documents raise one question. Can we afford to continue living in our cities like we lived up until now? Can we still afford to use the energy in the same way like we have used until now? What is our specific responsiveness and room to maneuver in response to climate impact? And how can we actually transform it? That's the part of transformation. And how, up until now, the roles that are taken up until now between the government organizations, between local organizations, between society, can these remain being the same way and address all of these issues in an effective way? So in that sense, also in terms of Lithuania, for me, being in different other countries, sometimes the thought comes to my mind, what is the identity of Lithuania and what identity does Lithuania want to have in the next 20, 30 years when it is looked from the outside towards Lithuania? What is the first thing that comes to the mind, and that is in relation to the development of comprehensive plan of Lithuania, that is now the chance to agree on the collective values and to look towards the future, projecting it, not only looking inside out, but trying to look outside in, what will be the values of Lithuania in the future and what are they now, and who needs to agree those values, and who is involved in that discussion. At the same time, what we see, and the biggest challenge ranging from China, Europe as well, is not so much the city, but that multiple impacts that didn't happen like that up until now. Climate change, social challenges, lack of housing, increasing gap between the different levels of society, all come at the same time. And I think this kind of challenge we haven't faced previously in the history. And that is where also, at least our opinion at AAT, is that often thinking globally, acting locally is good. But I think also for Lithuania is part of European Union, and the question is, what potentials has Lithuania not tapped into yet? What possibilities of European funding, of European urban collaboration has Lithuania not used yet? And for me, being in the EU projects quite a lot, I do miss the visibility of Lithuania in that context. And I do miss the visibility of Lithuanian cities in that context as well. So in this context, digitalization, how can we use, and it is being used in Vilnius already quite a bit, the new digital tools for decision makings and so on. This previous presentation, the fragmentation of urban space, I think it is also, we can easily say, it is actually a global issue. We see the same thing in South America, we see the same thing in African cities. The question is, none of other species destroy their own existing environment in the same way like we do, taking the resources out, assuming that they are never ending. And I think these are the questions, especially now in a discussion of the plan development, that we should actually ask ourselves maybe a little bit more, in a little bit more focused way. Cities, at the same time, although we have these numerous strategies and plans and actions and climate agreements, but the consumption of energy is still growing worldwide. So the question is, and this is kind of a proof that these strategies not yet go into efficiently enough into implementation, because the energy consumption is not reduced yet. So the question is, again, in governance as well as in all other aspects of society, what still needs to change? And of course, not to talk about pollution, the question is, can we remain healthy if we continue living in this type of, or behaving the same way like until now? This is one of the proofs a little bit in terms of pollution and impact, that in the meanwhile, cities emit the same amount of CO2 emissions as entire countries. So of course this may be, but to look at Lithuania as well, you know, who is the maximum consumer of energy? Where does it come from? What can be done? Because then we know this is the area to target. So these are kind of the facts that if you look, Tokyo alone has CO2 emissions of entire Netherlands. Then we kind of disconnect in our mind these ideas of, oh, climate change is somehow separate from that issue, but it isn't. It's like having a sink at home, overfilling with water, and wiping the floor, instead of turning off the sink. This is where we should actually start, at the root of the problem, and not trying then to just negotiate the effects of that issue, because this is much more difficult to do. This is what I mentioned before, the hunger for energy and projection from IEA, International Energy Agency, from 2008. If we continue as we have until now, and the question, where does it end? And what are the effects of that in terms of climate change as well? Just 2 weeks ago, Dubai had flooding. Dubai. So, you know, it's the question, it's not disconnected. We cannot separate Lithuania in that sense from the rest of the world and from Europe as well. Just this summer in Vienna, we had over 1 week, over 40 degrees. So the projections from the climatologists is that Viennese climate will become like southern Italy, but yet we see at the same time it's not only about more heat, but about more predictability and more unpredictable events in all types of issues and more sudden events. So the question how the cities can prepare and who is needed in that in this type of impact, but I will come a little bit more at the end of my presentation on this topic. So in a way, we hear quite a bit also when with any city that we work, say, yeah, but we have a different context. We have a different situation. We don't, this doesn't apply to us. In the end, all cities are made of buildings. People live in the cities. They have the infrastructure that is either resilient or not resilient. They have the same roads, so the spatial effects of the city are the same no matter where we go. So in that sense, I won't go in detail in all of these aspects. I think you all know that. Asking the questions such as how is water supply, how is my, also in the context of development of Bendrasis Planas, where are my vulnerabilities and where are my strengths, and will I be able to react to that in case of an impact? So at the same, this is the weird thing about the cities. They are kind of a problem and an answer at the same time. And yet we cannot say that cities are the only thing that exists. Still, food supply is not yet provided mainly by the cities. So in terms of Lithuania as well, what spaces do I designate for what purposes, and how clear is the designation between them, and what are the actions that all of these spaces can absorb? So in a way, this saying that cities can reinvent themselves because they have this diversity within them to actually cross-fertilize the production of ideas. So in that context, where one of the most dominant development directions at the moment in Europe, where a lot of funds are being directed as well, at least in Horizon 2020 projects. Millions of euros go in there that can be used for demonstration of these new activities. Is the more or less known smart city approach within which we are involved. And as the word smart implies, is actually that aspects which weren't connected up until now are being connected now. So climate debate, social equity debate, and debate on environmental responsibility, they come all together. And of course, we face challenges to actually just understand each other points and each other's perspectives from all of these different sectors, because I don't know how it is in Lithuania, but for instance also in Austria, once we have the sociology part also from the knowledge from universities and so on, and we bring them with technology experts, and we come ourselves partially urban development, technology experts and so on, we do have often difficulties to understand each other and to understand each other's language. And this collective integrated language is not there yet. And the willingness to listen and to open our mind to the different perspective and generate within that so-called integration. So in terms of governance in the context of transformation, we do have at the moment this type of structure, mostly national state governance, private sector, civil society, local governance. And we take it for granted, but we actually have created that structure. And the question within that is, does it still work in this way? And if yes, good. If it doesn't, what needs to change? And what we see at the moment, whether unintentional or not, what is changing is that, for instance, Germany, Austria, Netherlands, all the countries we worked with so far, and I will bring some examples later on in the presentation. I'm just setting kind of the foundation for that now. They all involve private sector in the development much more. So this, as was mentioned before, this heavy involvement top-down is decreasing, because also the funding, we kind of used to thinking the city will fund it, the national state will fund it, but to the level it won't be able to fund it. So we need to enable our capacity building on the ground and take in the private sector much more into responsibility and take the knowledge from private sector, from industries, also in the development of Bendrasis Planas in Lithuania, involving industrial actors who are capable, who are actually implementing, because the planning's nature is that it depends on private actors to implement. So if that is not considered early on, then the implementation is almost doomed to fail, because there are key aspects in know-how from bottom up that are not considered. So in that sense, the city governance between the local thinking and national state governance, if national state doesn't provide the regulations and doesn't provide political support and doesn't make sure that all energy sources are aligned in one direction, then the energy is sprawled and not directed into, then it's virtually impossible to achieve those goals, because everybody is going into a different direction. Not to mention civil society, because this is obviously changing due to different tools and possibilities to actually make decisions on the ground and to use civil society as a source. So in that sense, what we see, for instance, in Austria, especially in demonstration projects, that this transformation doesn't happen within used formal background. Most of the projects where actually new experimental solutions have been implemented are actually informal yet. They are not a used mode of action. They are not in the regulations, they are not in policy setting. They are actually, that's why it is transformation, because transformation implies that something that is coming is new, is not there yet. And that cannot be part of past background. So within that, the same is happening in many other cities, for instance, even in China, which is not known for its very democratic setting, but it's the same discussions that we're leading there, and I will show a little one small example of a project later on. And the question is, how can we unlock the potential of the population and society in actually using, or especially, for instance, in resilience background, in creating local communities that are strong in activity and are not always depending or waiting for the city to do something for them. And this is a big discussion at the moment also in Austria, across Europe, and in many other countries as well, not to see citizens as only passive actors. We even have in energy supply this change of terms from consumer to prosumer. Because in Austria, for instance, many people, they don't rely only on give me energy, please, but they produce energy and give it back. This is already a big transformation. They're selling that to the network energy network in Austria. It's entirely different mode of activity that the networks even haven't learned to deal with yet. And that's the actual transformation. I don't know how it is in Lithuania, what percentage of households are actually producing energy for themselves. But because in that case, if there is an impact, we are not relying on major networks. And this is changing also within AAT. We work on different grid concepts, smart grid concepts, and so on, which are able to interact with the entire system to make it a little bit more dynamic and not so static as it is until now. And in a way, looking at local communities in different sectors and who are the change agents within those sectors. So in that sense, when we talk about governance, there is a lot of scientific definition what is actually transformative governance. What is the role of governance and how is it changing? How is it opening the floor for more freedom to move, for new ideas? Because creative ideas don't happen in a cage of very strict regulations. The regulations are needed to control the implementation, but it needs space to bring in transformation. And these are kind of key aspects, especially transparency between the levels towards the population, from population, ability to respond quickly. Yes, follow the rule of law in agreements, but at the same time, provide this fertile ground and mindset within which the change can happen. So in that sense, looking at this way, because the word is integration, I think for the past 150 years, what we were used to is, okay, there is a mobility expert, he implements, and that's probably the pictures that we had seen before, he implements the streets. And when I worked in Ireland, it was always the question when I went to mobility experts, but we always did it like that. What do you want now? Why should I do the streets differently? So the streets were done by some sector, by energy by another sector, housing by another sector. And what we see more and more now, especially in demonstration projects, also in Austria, that all of these aspects are being planned at the same time. And the space urban development in the middle part is being used as a catalyst for this change, absorbing all of these aspects at the same time. And what is changing tremendously worldwide is that the land, which we for many centuries have not looked at as a resource. We look at natural resources, we look at forests, but the land itself as a resource, integrating all of these aspects in this context. And what we see, as I mentioned before, that the private sector which implements, at least in Austria, is being implemented at the very beginning of the stage, not once the plan was made, but the actual master plan is being developed, for instance, for the district part Aspern. From the very beginning, all of those who are involved in implementation are involved in the plan development themselves, including the local know-how of citizens as a resource. So in that sense, going to the spatial elements as a message from our experience towards the development of comprehensive plan of Lithuania, the most effective, to put it that way, the most effective way we have experienced so far was to actually designate action spaces, because regional responsibility, regional actions are different type of actions that can be addressed by different stakeholders who communicate with others than the urban actions and urban stakeholders. These communicating with each other, but creating clear, differentiated spaces for action. National space for action. On the national level, there are only certain implementations that can happen. Regional spaces of action. On the regional level, there is only specific areas that can be addressed, local and so on, to create kind of commitment of different actors on this specific level, which was done, for instance, in Switzerland. That's the model by which they go, and the same in Germany, kind of looking at these designated areas, for instance, on the building level, taking this kind of most zoomed in level of space, looking at the standards on urban design, master planning scale, looking at integration of those previously mentioned areas and so on, and the differentiated actors that need to create their actor community and communicate among each other within these dimensions in transformation. So this is kind of a bit of summary of current policy and transition policy, what we see also in Europe. First is limited number of factors and so on, which I mentioned already, new steering mechanisms, and first, most of all, the last line, linear knowledge development up until now. There is a plan, there is implementation and so on, but what is changing in demonstration projects at the moment, so-called lighthouse projects in Europe, is that it is learning, making space for experimentation, learning by doing and doing by learning. So it's in both directions and not being afraid to make mistakes. And this is just a very brief kind of go through our some key recommendations maybe from some projects. This is one project that we have now between numerous European partners and Chinese partners called Transurban EU China. It will continue until 2021. And within that project, we're looking actually at transformative capacity, local transformative capacity, and the possibilities to increase it, key components of that. Only because we have a strategy or only because we have plans doesn't mean that the local actors are capable or have yet the capacity and the mindset to actually implement them. And that's what I meant before with creating expert communities, local expert communities that communicate very closely with national, regional, and so on levels to actually increase that implementation capacity locally. And these are the questions that we are asking ourselves in this project as well. Ability to reflect, discussion culture, not hard factors, but soft factors of that, working across agency levels, working across political administrative levels, on geographical scales, which was mentioned already today in, I think Lithuania is there on a very, very amazing way. But again, this project development that is happening in Lithuania yet could be more visible in Europe, because many European countries don't have the same level of development that Lithuania is going through now. So I think using this process now, kind of, which doesn't happen very often, to actually present it in European platforms, and we are very much welcoming as well in Austria and so on in conferences to actually involve and make it a little bit more visible. The same thing, this is kind of was mentioned already, the decision-making processes that are different. This is very brief jump through our Transform project. As you see, this word transformation, transform, Transurban New China is featuring everywhere. This was a project we went through for 2 years between 6 cities, Amsterdam, Copenhagen, Genoa, Hamburg, Lyon, and Vienna. And the task of that project was actually to develop transformation agendas within each city. Yet the cities do have their plans, but this European setting was used to, between the cities, firstly to exchange their knowledge and their different modes of governance, transportation, what works, what doesn't work, how can we learn from each other. And secondly, to kind of find the common things that work and don't work. The goal was to actually create smart energy cities, reduce 2020 to achieve 2020 goals, which is 20% energy efficiency increase locally, 20% reduction of energy consumption, and 20% increase in renewable production. Yet each of these cities, of course, they have different goals, they have different starting positions, they have individual planning backgrounds, and within the project, we still could screen all of these aspects. What are the specifics along these layers in political, economic, social, technological, legal, environmental, governance, and spatial levels, and integrating those levels to see what works everywhere, what is common to all cities, and what is different to all of these cities. And what the entry point for solutions, let's put it that way, in each city is a different one. But the goals were similar. So in that sense, we have developed with each city their own transformation vision, aligning all forces in one direction, and yet very individual actions linked to very specific implementation plan in a city, in a district. So what we saw as well, you know, there is this ideal transformation path assumption, but the real transformation path is very different. And this is the last 3 slides of my presentation, is the urban transformation and resilience specific projects in Austria. So in essence, what we kind of summarize in our institute as a concept of resilience in this one picture, if an impact happens, the question that the city can ask itself is, do you bend or break? And what aspects in Vilnius would break and which ones are capable to bend? And of course, also looking at Vilnius, it is not ending at the boundaries of the Vilnius in case of a natural event. And it needs to be linked to all the surroundings in order to respond to that. In a little bit more specific aspect, in Austria, we're developing so-called power communities, bringing the capacity on the local level to actually react to these events. But as you see, the challenges are same as in Lithuania, or similar like in many other countries in Europe. There are decaying and shrinking towns. Sorry. People are also moving from small towns. So the infrastructure, it's not only growth, but also shrinking and empty places, aging population, and so on. So there is a very different need to actually act on the ground because of the vulnerability of the population groups. And most of all, also sealing of the surfaces, which make the resilience, addressing resilience quite difficult also in Austria. This project is just starting, so we don't have outcomes yet, but there are multiple smaller towns that put themselves together to address these issues together, because none of the towns is capable to do that only by themselves. And this is another research project that will go this year and next year, a so-called city ecosystem, creating urban, again, different city network within Austria to integrate all of these aspects in the picture on the right-hand side, from ecological aspects to living labs. Majority of the cities now have created these spaces that are kind of allowing for co-creations and testing of solutions that are not mainstream yet, So different districts within the cities and among the cities as well, and learning among them too. And most of all, in integrating cities, universities, private stakeholders, energy providers within those projects. And this is the last two ones. One project that we're doing now is called Lila for Green in Vienna, addressing heat islands in Vienna. And as you see in this label, there is a Viennese energy provider, university, and us, in specifically looking at possibilities to actually implement different kind of solutions and to test their effect on heat islands within the cities. Addressing the resilience issue and the overheating issue in Vienna. So this is the summary, that's the last slide. What it means for us, we had a brief discussion in our team towards the Lithuanian plan discussion, is actually, we think that Lithuania could clarify its spatial identities and diversity, different space for action. We think that these action spaces are very different in cities and on a countryside and a coastal area. Differentiation between national spatial development targets, regional spatial development targets, local spatial development targets, stopping the sprawl, obviously, and addressing different possible modes of connectivity. Is it possible to create a polycentric urban or town network? Establishing higher spatial development standards and matching instruments for implementation, because very often the implementation instruments are lacking. And maybe one possibility would be to think of specific demonstration areas which could be seen in Europe as well as worldwide, possibly, that Lithuania is known for. In cities, in districts, in Baltic region, and so on. And activating the change agents.